This suspect is dead tonight, shot by a state trooper. Shawn Sheridan was a wanted fugitive who jumped bail. The scene today in the town of Russell. With 7 News reporter Sean Brinda.
The scene on Donnerville Road in the town of Russell Thursday afternoon was filled with multiple state trooper vehicles and law enforcement officials from state police to the St. Lawrence County Sheriff's Office. St. Lawrence County District Attorney Gary Pasqua has confirmed that the fugitive, Shawn Sheridan, was found outside the town of Russell. According to Pasqua, Sheridan shot at state troopers with a gun. Troopers returned fire, killing Sheridan.
Through investigative efforts, we're able to track Mr. Sheridan. They came upon him in a wooded area, and Mr. Sheridan, as the state police indicated, opened fire on the officers, and they returned fire, and Mr. Sheridan was killed during that altercation.
A police canine was injured but is expected to be fine. Another person was with Sheridan at the time but was not injured in the firefight. Sheridan was a fugitive from the law for more than 2 weeks after he failed to show up to his sentencing for allegedly shooting his then fiancée in the neck after getting in an argument back in March of 2022. Sheridan had taken a plea deal for lesser charges. The judge sentenced him to 12.5 years in prison. Based on several purchases made, Pasqua says law enforcement had leads which brought them to the heavily wooded area in Donnerville State Forest where the shootout took place. Sheriff Brooks Bigwolf says law enforcement trains for this.
Everything was done correctly, and thankfully none of the officers got hurt at the scene.
Because it was an officer-involved shooting, the State Attorney General's office is reviewing the case. It may decide to keep the investigation or kick it back to Pasqua's office. Pasqua says until the AG's office makes a determination, he cannot say more about the case. Sean Brinda, 7 News.